Well, let's now briefly speak about climate change and climate action. So, climate change is really a defining challenge for Australian environmental policy. So, in Australia, there is this particular focus on how the rising temperature is affecting populations and how clear, hazards, environmental hazards such as the bushfires and the water scarcity we have spoken about are really, really leading to what is now described as a rapidly changing environmental landscape. So Australia's climate is changing faster than many regions, including other regions in the Asia Pacific, um, testing the nation's ability to really adapt and respond effectively. And there is this, what is now described as environmental or eco-anxiety that many Australians live with, the anxiety related to, the unpredictability of the Australian environment or what might happen in the future. And again, these are things we have all been experiencing over the last few months, especially with the recent cyclone in Queensland. It has really been clear a clear hazard, and we might want to discuss about that in more details. So other major debates include, of course, how quickly to transition from fossil fuels to non-emission strategies, which we had started speaking about, but also the role of government versus the market in inducing that plan and the responsibilities toward affected communities and who should be, responsible in cases where people are prone to environmental hazards, who should actually give compensation and who should be paying for that. Should the government be doing that? Should major companies, which are also contributing to the environmental hazards because of the work they do, should they be liable to paying for all of these environmental hazards we are experiencing? Actually, there is an ongoing debate around those kinds of questions. But again, as we said, Australia is currently facing what might be described as the climate crisis, with rising temperatures and more frequent extreme weather, leading to droughts, leading to bushfires, leading to the cyclones, and many other hazards which we have started mentioning earlier. Now, you might wonder, why does climate change matter? Climate change really poses significant risks for our health, homes, economy, environment. I would even add here well-being, and so on and so forth. So hotter days might increase bushfire with all the dangers the bushfire come with. We keep referring to the bushfire, but it's more than that. Heat waves, sometimes they might be unpredictable, but also at the same time, they might end up taking some of the lives. And that can be another factor contributing to, eco-anxiety and so on and so forth. But also the loss in biodiversity, as we started saying, there are impacts on farming activities and water supplies, and just how we live as Australians is just another core element of the risks environmental change poses, and climate change in particular poses to all of us. So because also of the geographic location of Australia, the fact that we don't have any other neighboring country, we are just surrounded by water, that makes us even more, prone to environmental hazard, but mostly prone to eco-anxiety, because people keep wondering, like, if things are not well in Australia, what can we do? Where can we find refuge? There is no border to cross. You can't go to, any next country, especially if the hazards are coming from the oceans. So it's just really challenging, and we might want to consider how this keeps impacting everyone in this country. So some effects we had started seeing already: greenhouse gas emission, which continue to rise. And of course, current policies are not enough to meet international targets, as we said, but also the effects are already visible in Australian communities, including on agriculture and the ecosystem. So the risks include, as I said, water shortage, loss of biodiversity, threat to human health, and eco-anxiety, and even death from environmental hazards, and many other effects which you might want to add on the discussion padlets. So now let's bring all this to real action. So on this interactive map, you'll be able to access it by clicking on this link here. So this interactive map really from climate change in Australia allows us to just explore how different regions across the Australia are being affected by climate change in particular. And it's a area where you can make your own predictions of what kind of weather conditions will be in specific locations in Australia by 2020, by 2030, or 2050, or any other year you might want to target. So really, really encourage you to engage in that exercise and see whether there is anything which surprises you, and how might these challenges affect your own community. If, for example, maybe you live, I don't know, in any of the locations, if you'd be able to identify the different locations, then you might see, you might put, the different words and numbers required there, and it could lead you to the area where you live, or where your parents live, or where your community members live, and then it can tell you a little bit on what will happen, what kind of weather and what kind of climate hazards can those people expect in the next few years. So for example, if people live in Murray Basin, you might see just random numbers, such as them expecting warm by 2.3 degrees annually in the next few years, with an 18% drop in winter rainfall. So what would that mean? And you might really, really want to discuss that in detail and see whether it tells you anything about the environmental hazards we might want to focus on in the future, and how ultimately do we plan for all these. So my idea here is not really to cause more environmental anxiety, but just to really engage you so that we start reflecting together in how these things can be addressed. So now another important aspect to consider here is how government and other stakeholders address climate challenges. So climate change in particular, government, and all other environmental hazards, in many cases, there will be two types of activities. One, like for any other disasters, one is around mitigation. That's activities aimed to lower emissions via renewable efficiency and forest protection. So activities which aim to prevent the hazards before they happen. But also there are adaptation activities which prepare people for the impact. It's kind of building preparedness by building resilient infrastructures and aiding vulnerable communities to cope with the predictable environmental hazards. So these are the two kind of activities really which are often prioritized, and they are the ones also prioritized not only in Australia's environmental policy broadly, but also they align with international legislation such as the Paris Agreement. There are all these meetings which are held internationally on the COP. The recent one I was watching was around the COP21. I don't know now which COP are we at now, so you might want to check that and see whether those international legislations are something Australia is committing to, and whether they are making any difference at all in the way we respond to climate change, and other environmental hazards. So, and of course, the goal here is to limit global warming, protect the environment, safeguard health and economies, and so on and so forth. Now, because we are speaking about the international legislations here, we also have to acknowledge that, environmental protection and environmental policy is not, again, only an Australian thing. Sustainable Development Goal 13, and even to some extent, Sustainable Development Goal 14 and even 15, all are really related to environmental policy and how we aim for sustainability in protecting the environment. So in the Australian context, some of the top priorities include reducing the emissions, as we started saying, reducing greenhouse gas emission. We started speaking about that. But more importantly, Australia is aiming at a net zero emissions by 2050. And there is an interim target, which are now being updated every year to see where we sit in the way we address emissions and whether we can achieve this target by 2050. But also, as I said, Australia is focusing on more renewable energy. No need to insist on that. But also campaigns on planting trees and the understanding that forests get to absorb more CO2 and boost biodiversity via tree planting. And of course, more importantly, Australia is also focusing on sustainable transport, encouraging many people to use public transport instead of driving, because of the understanding of how the more cars we drive, the more emissions we produce, and the more hazards we might end up creating in our society. So clear examples of climate action in Australia, many different activities, including activities from Indigenous folks, groups called the Indigenous Rangers get to manage land using fire and traditional practices to restore ecosystems. But also all the activities around solar citizens, promoting solar energy uptake across communities. And of course, in cities like Melbourne, there is a switch to now 100% renewable energy for municipal operations. You'll see that if you want to buy a property in Melbourne, you might see that many properties on the market are using renewable energy rather than, non-renewable energy. And of course, many other activities, including youth-led action, which really demonstrate some sort of commitment to climate policy and climate action in particular. So again, all this is being funded at different levels, including federal government level, but also private investment and international cooperation and partnership. So the question is now for you to consider which Australian political party has the best, well, maybe not the best possible strategy in mitigating and promoting adaptation and social policy, as we have discussed so far. Which of these, including the current Albanese policy and the previous ones, we could, if we wanted, we could also have even Scott Morrison here, who had his own policies of addressing it. And again, we shall try to engage in this kind of activity and drop our thoughts on, the Padlet below. So you are not meant to only use these two figures. You can use other policy statements, maybe from the Greens, who are very much engaged to environment protection. You might also want to refer to other political parties and see really what are they prioritizing in, supporting environment policy and climate action in particular. So here we have a few questions. You might want to engage with those. I'll add also them into the workbook. And of course, there are a few answers, and I'll see you in the next module.